Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas is proud to sponsor events like the one you're about to see because we love to see Texans get involved in public dialogue and civic engagement.
I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune, and I want to welcome you to the last session of the Tribune's week-long symposium previewing the 2021 legislative session. It's our Reporters Roundtable, a conversation with four of my favorite newsroom colleagues. I say that to all my newsroom colleagues. Some of the best young reporters covering what's setting up to be an unprecedented and unpredictable 140 days or more at the Capitol. Let me introduce them briefly so we can dive right into our discussion of the issues and the politics and the parties and the personalities and all the rest. Cassi Pollock covers state politics for the Tribune and co-writes The Blast, our subscription-only daily newsletter for political insiders. Alex Samuels is a political reporter who writes stories about the intersection of race and politics and is also one of the primary authors of The Blast. Patrick Svitek covers politics for the Tribune as our primary correspondent on the campaign trail. He covered the 2016, 2018, and 2020 election cycles for us. And finally, Alexa Ura, our demographics reporter who covers voting rights issues with a particular emphasis on the state's surging Hispanic population. Welcome to you all. Good to be with you, even if it's just virtually. Before we can have a session, we have to have an election to determine who makes up the 181 spots in the House and Senate. Despite the insistence of Democrats and even some Republicans that change was coming to the Capitol, this session is the byproduct of an election cycle that was a nothing burger. So, same partisan split in the House, nearly the same in the Senate. Republicans are still in a solid majority position in both. Patrick, all that time, all that effort, all that money, and we're back where we started.
Yeah, in many ways, it was a status quo election, at least when you look at the state legislature. I think the most important change that we saw was in the state Senate with the Republicans losing their supermajority there. And that obviously could have an impact on how things are run there this session if Dan Patrick pushes to change the rules to lower the 3/5 rule and lower the threshold that's required to bring legislation to the floor. So I think that was probably the most impactful electoral change that happened.
Right.
But when you look at the state House, for example, that's where a lot of that time and money and effort was put into. Democrats thought they had a real shot at flipping the state House. They were 9 seats away from the majority. And that push, despite all the money, time, and effort, really fizzled. They gained 1 seat and they lost 1 seat. And so it was a wash, and the balance of power is unchanged there.
Yeah, Alex, you covered the Democrats for us a fair amount over the course of the presidential campaign, and you have a sense of how the candidates approached this cycle. There's disappointment in Democratic Party ranks, is there not? And there's the certain phenomenon at this point, as there often is every 2 or 4 years, of finger pointing and recriminations.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's the case. I think there's a lot of internal what went wrong happening now in the Democratic Party. I know Patrick wrote a story that's on our site now, just at the Texas Democratic Party, looking internally at what went wrong. I think Democrats are saying, what is the impact of not campaigning amid the coronavirus? How did that, what went wrong with our polling and all that? So I think the party's going to do some deep thinking into what they can do for the next election cycle.
Yeah, and they had a lot of hope coming out of 2018. That was a better election cycle for them than they had seen in a long time. The concern, if you're a Democrat, Alex, must be that you head out of 2020 and into 2022 to the next state elections and to legislative elections kind of in despair as opposed to hope. It's a very different affect coming out of this election cycle.
Right. I think after 2018, when Beto O'Rourke, had long coattails and was able to help a lot of Democrats down ballot, in 2020, yep, Democrats were obviously looking to replicate that and do better, and that just wasn't the case this year.
Didn't happen. Cassi, the Republicans in the House, on the other hand, were on the verge of losing their majority, or at least many of them were saying up through and including Election Day that they thought they were at risk of losing their majority, they really had a near-death experience and came out of it pretty well intact.
Yeah, I mean, Republicans were openly acknowledging the possibility of there being a 1, 2, 3 seat margin in the House, or Democrats just flipping the chamber entirely, and you kind of saw that play out in the speaker's race, where you had a number of Democrats and Republicans jump in and try to launch a bid for speaker heading into Election Day. Obviously, by midnight election night, Republicans and Democrats both knew that the margin was going to be remaining somewhat the same, and that Republicans would hold on to their roughly 9-10 seat majority in the House.
And they would also get to keep the speakership, which was an open question as well. And we'll talk about Dade Phelan shortly, Cassi. But all in all, for them and heading into the session, it's a pretty good time to be a Republican in Texas.
Yeah, good to be a Republican, especially with redistricting coming up. I know Alexa knows way more about that than I do, but one of the talking points for Dems and one of their rallying cries was, the fact that if they flip the House, that they would at least have a seat at the redistricting table. That's not really going to be the case anymore. With Republicans in charge of every major state office, and in charge of both chambers, and in charge of the governor's office. So definitely a reality that Democrats are going to have to reckon with coming up this legislative session.
Alexa, if we were in the office working together, I would be coming over to talk to you around now to say, let's talk about the demographics of the legislature, how the chambers are made up. Because you and I love to talk about that stuff. I'm always interested. I know you are as well, in how representative the legislature is of the state. Is the makeup of the body going to be any different this time than it was the last time? It looks to me, at least, that it's older, maler, and whiter than the state it governs.
Yeah, I don't think, talk about a status quo election. I don't think there were many changes in terms of demographic representation and who was elected and how out of sync that is with the state. I haven't finished looking through all of the numbers. I think during the last legislative session, we pointed out that there were more, I think it was more men named John than there were Republican women. It'll be interesting to see how those sort of smaller data points line up after this election. But I don't think you're going to see many different changes. Obviously, there are reasons why that matters, and who is actually represented at the Capitol, whose experiences are represented at the Capitol. I don't think we're going to see that much of a change once the session is actually gobbled in.
Cassi, let me come back to you for a second and ask you about your reporting on the changes likely to come to the Capitol and to this session as a consequence of the pandemic. I mean, if to Alexa's point, the demographics aren't different, the process of how we meet and do the state's business should be significant in the middle of what appears to be an ongoing, raging public health emergency. They're moving in the House and in the Senate toward having protocols in place that would restrict access to the building, to the chambers, to the committee rooms, and change the way members do business. You are hearing what the rest of us are hearing. This is going to be a different session.
Yeah, I don't think anyone can dispute that session's just going to look different in terms of what's in place and the types of practices and protocols the Capitol, the House, and the Chamber and the Senate end up deciding on. I think there's like two main questions that folks who are in charge of making those decisions are asking themselves. What kind of access do we want to give to the public with this legislative process, and how easy can we make that access? And to follow that up, what sorts of practices and protocols are we looking at? How would we be opening ourselves up to constitutional challenges, right? What is allowed under the Constitution, and what would we be thinking about passing that could possibly open the door for legal lawsuits or legal challenges? Again, based on what we end up doing. Over in the House Administrative Chair, Charlie Guerin was talking to a group of lobbyists last week, talking about limiting the number of, people allowed inside the building, talking about testing before you're allowed inside the building. The House is a little bit different than the Senate in that you have 150 House desks on the floor, plus staff It's a little bit, more tight quarters than the Senate and its 31 desks. And, all of that's just kind of still being talked about right now. In the Senate, similar conversations are playing out. Dan Patrick had a virtual meeting with senators on Friday and was talking about, people who want to come to the Capitol to testify on legislation having to register online 3 days in advance and, take a test for the coronavirus 24 hours before they're allowed inside the building. So a lot of this is just really kind of up in the air. And I think folks are, lawmakers, lobbyists, everyone else who is planning to be part of the process is getting antsy on just, having some answers and some clarity on what all this ends up looking like come January, which is, at this point, only a few weeks away.
Yeah, it seems like
Alex, I think about the reporting you've done with groups of regular Texans who feel like the process needs to do better in serving their interests and in paying attention to the issues that they're concerned about. This happens, of course, over the course of a political season, but heading into a session, those very same groups of folks, those same individuals are going to be watching to see whether the Capitol is a place they can responsibly go to press their case. Is your sense that it matters to those folks whether they're physically in the room with legislators or whether they're going to be happy with some redesigned protocol to have their input heard? That at the end of the day is the debate that we're going to be having. The degree to which the legislative session is the people's session and therefore requires that people be allowed in the Capitol, in committee rooms, or whether this can be transacted virtually. What do you think? What's your read?
I think that as long as people have a way to talk to lawmakers in an open setting, whether that be virtually or in person, I would think that if that's allowed under the Constitution, that's the way the legislature wants to go. That would please the people who want to testify in front of the Capitol. Of course, Austin is very centralized. A lot of people who testify don't live in Austin, so making it virtual might actually increase the number of people who are able to testify on different bills. So I don't know if that's something that the legislature and different lawmakers are taking into account when they're thinking about how they're going to conduct virtual committee hearings and all that. But I would think as long as they have an open forum for people to talk with lawmakers in the way that they have in the past, that would be a decent option for folks.
You make a good point. It actually might have the effect of creating more access for people, right? If it doesn't have to be done in person.
Evan, I would just point out that I think in previous sessions, there are many, many bills on which you could determine the vote even before public testimony began. And even though you see enormous amounts of people come and testify against a bill, a committee is probably going to vote it out anyway. Obviously, that doesn't mean we should shut off the public component of session by people who are elected to represent people. But I think it's one of those things that you also have to consider, how do we make this more accessible to people in a way that doesn't endanger them for something that may not actually change? If you think about something like the bathroom bill, you had hundreds of people come and testify for hours and hours, and the votes never changed. The only reason that didn't happen was because of leadership in one chamber. And so I think that's something to consider as you think of the public testimony part. It doesn't always change votes, but we have seen it come up in lawsuits. We have seen the enormous amount of opposition to something be cited by a judge in knocking a bill down or knocking an initiative down. And I think that'll be something to consider and think about, you would think that lawmakers should consider and think about, because at least the courts will be looking for that.
Right. So, Patrick, leadership has been mentioned at least once in the last couple of minutes on in our discussion. I want to ask you about leadership, because at the end of the day, while the 181 members of the legislature, which would include whoever is Speaker in the House, of course, while those folks matter, really leaders set the tone, leaders set the agenda, and ultimately the ability of leaders to either be on task and aligned or not is the story of any session. So let me ask you for the scouting report on the three bigs, as it were. Give me the shorthand version of Abbott, Patrick, and in the case of the Speaker, presumptive Dade Phelan, and what you're thinking and hearing is the case with their relationship and what their priorities are likely to be, aligned or not.
Yeah, what I was going to say earlier is that as we wait for these safety protocols to come out and we have a precise idea of what the session is going to look like, it feels like we've been in a holding pattern to see what exactly state leaders' agenda is. They have acknowledged the obvious, that it's going to be a tough budget session. Obviously, there's redistricting to deal with. There is coronavirus-related issues to deal with. Those are all the obvious kind of must-do issues that would be on anyone's agenda, whether it's state leaders or rank-and-file lawmakers. But beyond that, in terms of the priorities that are top of mind for the governor, for the speaker, and for the lieutenant governor, we really haven't heard much. We know, for example, that heading into this session, during the campaign season, heading into this session, that the governor has put forward some legislative proposals in a campaign context to punish cities who, quote, defund the police, as he seems to define it. So that may be one of the more politically charged issues that tops his agenda. But really, I think as we wait to see what the session is going to look like due to the pandemic, we just have not, those priorities have not come into public view, at least in the way, at the pace that they have in the lead up to previous sessions.
Alex, I interviewed for this symposium a group of members who are on Team Phelan in the House and were supporters of his early on in his bid to be the leader of the House. And one of those was Joe Moody, who was the Speaker pro tem in the 86th session, Democrat from El Paso. And here is what he told me when we talked about the agenda question that Patrick alluded to. Representative Moody said, the key to this legislative session is very straightforward, and it is the Texas recovery. If we're focused on anything other than the economic or healthcare recovery of the state, that we're not spending our time wisely. Seems to me that we're going to have a tension between what is the most urgent business that we need to do to get this state back upright, and, to Patrick's point, some of the more sort of side dish issues that may not seem as critical in this moment, but populate any session agenda. Things like defunding the police or ending taxpayer-funded lobbying, another thing that the governor has called out as something that is a priority for him. So what do you think the balance is going to be between the must-dos, the urgent stuff, and the stuff that tends to end up as sharp objects on the table?
Right. I think as what Patrick said, just piggybacking off of that, things like the budget, redistricting, funding education, those are going to, and coronavirus relief, those are probably going to be the four issues that will be top of mind for any lawmaker, Republican or Democrat. I think the order of importance for those issues is probably going to vary, as you were saying. So I think at the end of the day, there may be tension as far as which bills get heard first, which bills seem to be moving faster through the legislative process. But at the end of the day, I think everyone's priorities are the same on that front. In the brief conversations I've had with members of the Black Caucus too, they're also looking at some sort of George Floyd Act. So I know that's top of mind for them. I'm sure Republicans are, looking at some sort of maybe quote back the blue legislation. So I don't know how big of an issue that's going to be. But I think the big main issues will be the same regardless of party.
So let's take the two biggest, of course, the ones that they're obligated to do this session. Let's start with redistricting, Alexa, and then Cassi, I want to ask you about the budget, because we know that in this session, whatever else they do or do not do, they cannot leave this session without having accomplished those two things. Alexa, what is the state of play on redistricting right now? Where are we? What is the timing of it likely to be? And how contentious will it be? Or will it be more of a shrug of the shoulders? This is how it goes every 10 years. This is how it's going to go this time.
I think from a logistical standpoint, there are still questions about when states are going to get the data that they need to actually do the map drawing. There have been sort of back and forth from the Trump administration on when those numbers were going to come in, whether it was going to be delayed past when lawmakers would still be in session. I think the latest, I believe, was that there was still going to be a possible delay into January, if not maybe February. Normally lawmakers get sort of the granular data to start drawing maps in March. So I think that's the big question. Obviously, when you end up drawing maps might mean you have more or less to negotiate with outside of redistricting if you're trying to get a very specific map or a specific line drawn. Beyond the logistics, though, we talked about this being kind of a status quo election, which it was, and obviously it was a bad night for Democrats relative to the expectations they set. But it was a new status quo, right? 2018 allowed them to make some gains that hadn't existed before. And even though 2020 was a terrible night for them, they are at least better positioned than they had been 2 elections ago or 2 sessions ago going into redistricting. And that's going to matter in terms of who are incumbents in what seats. I think once you start looking at the numbers, it gets a little more complicated. You've got a bunch of seats that are overpopulated. You've got a bunch of Republican seats in particular that are overpopulated. And if you're going to try to hold a Republican map, which obviously the majority is going to try to do because they are in control, I think the big question is, do you shore up those Republican districts that came probably closer than some would have liked in these 2 elections? Do you try to create a bigger advantage like you did after the 2010 elections? Or do you find a balance between the two that doesn't leave you, out and confused and stressed when you get to sort of the end of the decade when the maps don't hold to demographic and population change?
So is your bet, just if I ask you right now on the spot, is your bet that we'll be able to do this in a regular session, or are we having to kick this to a special session?
I would be surprised if we could get this done in a regular session.
Okay, so no vacation plans for anybody on this call. We're still going to be here over the summer, it turns out. Cassi, ordinarily the only thing lawmakers are constitutionally obligated to do during a session is pass a budget in balance. Spoiler, they will pass a budget in balance. The question is, what kind of a budget is it going to be? Is it going to be an enabler of all of our hopes and dreams, or is it going to be a hot diaper? What do you think?
Yeah, I think no one really knows. We have 2 somewhat recent data points that we're working off of. We'll have a third one just before session starts, and all 3 are coming from Comptroller Glenn Hager. In July, he forecasted a roughly, $4.6 billion deficit heading into the legislative session. Obviously, the coronavirus pandemic fueled that. Oil and gas prices, also weren't doing anybody any favors. And then, more recently, he was speaking to the Legislative Budget Board and said, my forecast from July is actually doing a little bit better than anticipated. I'll have more numbers and more information to give you heading into January. So,
of course, Cassi, better is not the same as good, right?
Right. Better is not the same as good. And, Hager was also caveating all of this with, I'm not sugarcoating anything. It's going to be tough to, plug up holes from this, budget that we're finishing, that we're going to be finishing, and then writing the next budget as well, the next 2-year budget. Lawmakers that I've spoken with don't really want to say or speculate publicly what types of options they're looking at. Of course, whenever you're talking about budget shortfalls, conversation starts to kind of start back up again on new revenue sources, gambling, the legalization of, marijuana, the list goes on and on. I'm sure some of that will be getting some play again this time too, but haven't really seen too much on that front yet. And I imagine we will probably see a little bit more just play out just as, the budget picture comes into focus a little bit more whenever Hager gives his update in January.
And of course, the $64,000 question, or more accurately, the $11.6 billion question is, can we find the money to fully fund the school finance reforms enacted last session? Right, Cassi, you're hearing that that's a topic of conversation as well.
Yeah, finding a additional new revenue streams for that. That was something that now retiring House Speaker Dennis Bonnen and, the public education chief in the House, Dan Huberty, were openly acknowledging as they were wrapping up the last session, right before the pandemic had even entered the picture, was that that lawmakers were going to have to work over the interim to try to, get some clarity on that. So that's still top of mind. TBD again on all of that. We'll see what happens.
But it affects every single member in every single member's district, right? Hey, Alex, so we've talked about the coronavirus, talked around the coronavirus. The reality is that we had public health challenges before there was a pandemic. We couldn't be more aware of those challenges than we are now. We have more people without insurance than we did before the pandemic. We have a full-blown rural healthcare crisis. Racial disparities in healthcare and access to care existed before, but they've really been surfaced anew. Legislature has not been able in recent years to tackle this bucket of issues. Are they going to be willing or able to do it when there's less money available to solve the problem? You've written about some of the racial disparities in healthcare and as related to the coronavirus specifically. What is your sense of the appetite of the legislature to really tackle this problem head on?
In talks I've had with several members of the legislature, there definitely seems to be an appetite. I know Joe Moody, as you mentioned previously, had mentioned how covering, basically making sure that there's some bill passed to address the racial disparities in coronavirus and making sure it is an equitable session, I believe was his term, is definitely top of mind. Members of the Black Caucus are definitely looking at that too. Again, I think it just remains to be seen the order of importance. I think the budget, of course, is going to be first, and education redistricting will probably be shortly thereafter. So I'll be interested to see how COVID relief and addressing the disparities looks for different lawmakers.
Okay. Hey, Patrick, let's talk about some politics here at the end. I always worry that in a boring election cycle where it's basically status quo, there's not going to be nearly enough drama for our taste. And then boom, Alan West. God's gift to journalists at the moment in Texas, right? So the still relatively new Republican Party chair has taken on the Republican governor, has taken on the incoming Republican speaker. Will all this fomenting against his own kind amount to anything in this session?
Look, I mean, he has this platform and he intends to use it in a much more assertive way than I think past chairs have used it. He plans to be very aggressive in pushing for the party's legislative priorities at the Capitol, which I think there's several of them, and some of them are things that a lot of Republicans agree on. Like, you mentioned ending taxpayer-funded lobbying. Some of them are issues that do not enjoy universal support among Republicans, things like constitutional carry or unlicensed carry of firearms. And so it'll be very interesting to see, number one, how aggressive he is in pushing those priorities and what his tactics are in pushing those priorities this session. And number two, how receptive and how influential he is with members. I mean, we had a story a couple weeks ago where we had some members, not all of them, obviously, saying, I don't care what Alan West says, I'm going to do what's right for my district. That's obviously a very, diplomatic and political thing to say heading into the session. And this is all ahead of a 2022 election cycle in which most of the major statewide officials are up for re-election, including Governor Abbott. And there's a lot of speculation that Alan West wants to challenge Abbott in the primary. And so as a result of that, it's very interesting to see how Abbott's agenda is shaped by him perceiving a primary threat. Right now, I think Abbott is probably a little more concerned with a primary in 22 than the general election in 22.
Than a general election, for sure. Well, drama now, drama later. We love it no matter what it is and when it comes. As we end here, we're a little bit long, but I want to just ask you very quickly, kind of in game show speed round fashion, each of you, tell me an issue we haven't talked about that you think pops up on the agenda of the session, and give me a member of the legislature who you're keeping your eyes on as somebody who may emerge as a major player, maybe somebody who we're not thinking about now, but we will be talking about and thinking about over the next 7 to 9 months. Alex Samuels, you first. Give me an issue, give me a member.
Ooh. I'm always looking at the big culture wars, so I'll be interested in marijuana and what happens with that, whether it's, a push for legalization, decriminalization, and that. As far as members, I'll go with Jim Murphy because he was just elected chair of the GOP caucus, and see if he makes any waves this session.
Good. Alexa, what do you think? An issue that we're not talking about right now and somebody who you think emerges as a player?
For me, it's going to be election legislation. We obviously just went through an election that really stressed the system, and I continue to question whether Republicans would have liked to have online voter registration available to them or not. Obviously, they still won, so maybe nothing happens. In terms of players, I will kind of be keeping an eye, I think, on Donna Howard. We saw her sort of emerge during the speaker's race with, the Equity Caucus. I think she's always someone interesting.
Women's Equity Bloc, right?
And so I always think she's someone interesting to watch, and I will be I think it'll be interesting to watch her during the session.
Okay. Cassie, an issue and a member.
All right, since I have to mention an issue that we haven't yet discussed, I'm going to go with expanding rural broadband access in the state.
Oh, that's very smart. That's a safe choice, Cassie. Safe choice.
I'm going to go with probably Tom Oliverson, who is just Cypress Republican, I believe elected vice chair of the caucus.
Vice chair.
And healthcare. He's an anesthesiologist. And if I didn't have to go with him, then I would go with probably Mays Middleton, Freedom Caucus type. Taxpayer funded lobbying is the issue that he's going to be carrying. So those are my answers.
Good. Both good answers. And then Svitek. finally for you, an issue and a member.
For my issue, I would go at homelessness. I think the governor and some senior Republicans are still interested in doing something in reaction to the situation in Austin. I know that's kind of faded from our radar, but I think there is still some legislative momentum behind that. What exactly, I don't know. A member probably would say State Senator Eddie Lucio, Democrat from Brownsville, depending on how the rules change or do not change in the Senate this session. He could be an even more important member than usual, especially after just winning re-election and beating back a challenge from his left and potentially being a little more unrestrained by political considerations going into his next term.
You might think of him as the 19th.
Exactly.
That's like an inside joke sort of, right, among us, right? The 19th, get it? He may be the 19th as the Republicans go. Hey, you guys, it was great to talk to you. Thank you. We're going to leave it there. Thanks so much to Cassi, Alex, Patrick, and Alexa for breaking away from the newsroom and a busy reporting moment to join us. Thanks again to the sponsors of our week-long symposium. Thanks especially to all of you for tuning in. We'll see you soon at another great virtual Texas Tribune event. To keep up with the Tribune's coverage this session, visit texastribune.org or sign up to get the latest news from the legislature in your inbox at trib.it/ledge. Happy holidays, everybody. Stay safe. Thank you.